mean, ironically, it didn't even really happen with Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you now have a Russia that's an aggressor and invading a neighboring country. So maybe the logic never really held in the first place. But certainly it's the case that the Chinese Communist Party is not liberalized. So having, a couple decades now of seeing China, be in the WTO and having all this capital investment from the U.S. and around the world, and still not liberalizing. How should we be looking at this now?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the WTO because, of course, that was something that happened under President Clinton, whereby permanent normal trade relations status was given. Most favored nation status, PNTR as it's called, was given to the People's Republic of China. That should not have happened. That was a mistake. And sadly, now, decades later, we're now inextricably linked economically to the point where we're so dependent upon imports from China that if we were to remove that status from the NAW, that would radically increase tariffs on goods coming in from China by 30 to 50%. It would make many of the goods on the shelves in Costco and Walmart prohibitively expensive. So again, we're in a much more serious state now because we're more linked with them and exposed them economically. So that is the problem. So there have been bills and lots of discussions in Congress and elsewhere about removing that status from China. But of course, that would definitely create a shock, to say the least, if we did that. So again, China again breaks the rules of the WTO. I'm so glad you mentioned it, Matt, because they self-identify as a developing country. Indeed, I was told even just up until last year, they were receiving development aid from the United Kingdom. So again, they're not a developing country in that sense. They shouldn't be self-identifying at the WTO as a developing country. And of course, because they have such a lack of transparency, and we don't have evidence or transparent evidence about what's going on in China or what their status really is in just about anything, because they lie and we have a campaign of disinformation. Therefore, we don't really know. So again, they get to break all the rules. They get to have do whatever they want, and primarily that's because there's so many people getting rich and people who are heavily exposed to them, particularly American companies. And those companies, particularly Wall Street, are lining the coffers a lot of U.S. congressmen and senators. And so it is difficult to address these issues and get traction.
Well, so isn't that an argument for, if we're so economically dependent on China, isn't that an argument against using this $1 trillion of debt? Because isn't the economic exchange between the U.S. and China worth much more than that?
Well, yes, and I think we need to defend the international system of trade and finance from the PRC's breaking of international finance law. And what the Securities and Exchange Commission and any other relevant government agencies need to ensure is that the PRC cannot issue new sovereign debt in the United States until such a time that they have made at least satisfactory settlement on their defaulted sovereign debt owed to American bondholders.
So what do you think the U.S. should do about this debt? What could the consequences, the results of leveraging this be?
Well, the three primary credit rating agencies need to incorporate this defaulted sovereign debt into their sovereign debt credit ratings. So, for example, Congress could require the SEC to compel the credit rating agencies, and then, of course, that would seriously incorporate the debt into their credit rating. And therefore, that would, of course, remove China's A rating, which they should not have. And, of course, it would make it very difficult for them to issue new sovereign debt until that issue was resolved.
I mean, I think what's interesting here is that despite China not paying this older debt, they're still issuing new debt constantly. And there was a big tranche of debt they issued a couple of years ago that American investors bought up, I guess, with the belief that it's going to be paid back, as you do if you are going to believe that if you buy the debt. But doesn't that seem, I guess, stupid?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of solutions to when a country doesn't want to pay their debt or cannot pay debt. For example, when Iraq was liberated, James Baker went around the world and got every country that they owed debt to cancel that debt, except the one country that didn't, of course, was the People's Republic of China. Or, for example, in the case of Argentina, when they're about to default, I mean, China could potentially say, well, look, if we had to pay this off, we might collapse economically, we might default on other debts. And in those circumstances, for example, with Argentina going to the IMF, you bring the creditors around the table, we all agree to a haircut, and there's goodwill, and creditors will renegotiate the debt so they can get at least the principal back. And it often involves a lot of goodwill. I'm afraid there's not a lot of goodwill at the moment, and China's never sought any of those alternative options. They've simply selected default and said it's not our responsibility. But given that China demands a one China policy, which incorporates Taiwan, they can't really say that this is Taiwan's debt, and we recognize in the United States a one China policy. So again, they use conflicting arguments, they break rules, they break laws, and they're never held to account, and they're in a very strong position.
And so if America called in the debt and they just refused to pay, what would that do?
Well, what the president can do, as he could require the Treasury Secretary to purchase these bonds from U.S. bondholders, and effectively for pennies on the dollar, because who else is going to purchase them? And then, of course, have them on the Treasury books for future negotiations, or it could potentially just pay off the $850 billion debt the United States owes China with these gold-denominated bonds. Say, here, you've defaulted on these. We will now pay off our debt with this. And I might add that this debt they owe the American bondholders is well over $1 trillion. So it dwarfs the $850 billion that we owe them.
Well, it just seems to me so strange that that hasn't been done. I mean, that would help America's credit rating. It would help the economy. Why isn't it being done?
Well, I must say that, over the past few decades, there have been a number of resolutions by both Democrats and Republicans. There's been broad support, bipartisan support. This is not a partisan issue. Like I said, the reaction to my op-ed's been bipartisan. I've spoken with both sides of people on the political divide in Washington. And that's been going on for years at the congressional level. Lots of resolutions, lots of joint letters going up to the executive. It's when they go up to the executive, and that involves both Republican and Democrat administrations, it gets ignored. They say, thank you very much for this, and nothing ever happens. And even in the Trump administration, you had, for example, some people like President Trump, who was very, very hard line on China. And then you had people such as Secretary Mnuchin, who's personally heavily exposed in business to China. He, of course, didn't want to address these issues. So again, you have a divide within parties. You have a bipartisan divide on these issues, and that really it requires the executive, it requires the administration in Washington to actually negotiate. I mean, we've had domestic courts, like in cases like Jackson et al., will rule that when the bondholders have sued in U.S. domestic courts, they say, yes, this is the responsibility of the People's Republic of China. The U.S. States Foreign Claims Settlement Commission has said the exact same thing, but they have no jurisdiction to enforce this. It requires the federal government at the executive level to negotiate this.
I'm wondering, the reaction to your article, it went very viral. Were you surprised at all by that?
I was surprised only because I've been researching this off and on since 2015, when I was actually working in another position. I had clients who had these. And I remember speaking to people in Washington at the time about it, and they said there's no political will at the executive level, but yes, there was a lot of interest in Congress. But again, not everyone in Congress, of course, because a lot of senators and congressmen are paid and have to take donations from people who are heavily exposed and companies that are heavily exposed to China, to the PRC. So, like I said, there really wasn't. Now, I think it's because we're in a new Cold War, and again, there's a lot of cross-party support with the new China Select Committee in Congress. I think we're in a different place. But before, a lot of people just said, let's not upset the apple cart. We're both getting rich. Both countries are getting rich. And eventually there was, as I said, that naive belief that they'll eventually just become like us and embrace Western norms and values. That hasn't happened.
I wonder have you been facing any pushback since the article came out?
I haven't personally felt a lot of pushback. What I will say is that the response has been overwhelmingly positive from both sides of the political divide in Washington. What I would say is that there is a history of the PRC taking these bonds very seriously and intimidating American citizens. For example, the American Bondholders Foundation, their principals have had their websites attacked. They've had a lot of intimidation from the agents of the PRC. That's been going on for years. Also, when I was looking at this first in 2015, I had clients who, for example, had actually sold their bonds to bogus front organizations for the PRC. And in some cases, in fact, I just heard of a new case just a few weeks ago. An American lady sold her bonds, she insured them for over $20,000, gave them to some front organization, and said, we're going to send them to Hong Kong for processing and safekeeping. And of course, she never sees them again, and she's wasted all this money. So that's been going on for literally a long years now. That's been going. I was aware of that when I first started looking into this, that they've saw this as a potential problem years ago, and so they have engaged in a lot of intimidation and fraud to try to hoover up these bonds. So that's been going on. Also, when there are congressional hearings, when there have been congressional hearings in the past, and witnesses have given evidence, then of course they've had, for example, the banks who maybe hold these bonds have said, "Oh, we don't want to hold these bonds for you anymore. Get rid of them," because that bank was heavily exposed to China. So they've used that kind of influence to harass and intimidate American citizens.
So China takes this threat very seriously.
Very seriously. And we should take it seriously too.